they didn't really use very scientific investigation.
Well, there were a number of axes that were possibilities, but there might have been some other instruments.
Did they figure out, for instance, was it a left-handed wielder or a right-handed wielder?
No, I don't think this was ever determined.
I thought that in the cases I read, they said that they had the exact size of the axe.
They have many of the axes.
No, I don't think it's possible to get an exact size of an axe. An axe doesn't cut through sharply. It cuts, and particularly hitting the brain, it moves the skull, or it opens the skull. If you've seen the photographs of the skulls, the damage was pretty badly done.
As an old woodsman, I know that you can tell who has chopped. If you know people's chopping habits, you can tell who chopped a given log.
Well, you're not dealing with heads. You're dealing
I realize
with,
this. With heads go yush and stuff oozes out. It gets really horrible. But they could tell if it was a left-handed or a right-handed axeman.
Yeah,
they had checked that out.
Probably so, but the amount of damage that was done, this wasn't a clean cut. The legend says 40 to 41 whacks. It's probably, I think, 17
this
or 13.
This one says there was one place that was a clean cut. I shouldn't say this one. I'm holding up Radden's book, Edward D. Radden. Maybe what we should do is take a break and then let Jordan run through some of the specific theories and then take it from there. A couple of things before we get back into this. The country store begins at 12:45. The lines will be open after the news. And we have no tickets for the Melody tent this week. Okay. Now, there are any theories, but maybe you could outline the first, or the major book. I think it was by a man by the name of Pearson, which is one that many people have used as a Bible, writing about Lizzie.
The first of the books was written by a reporter for the Florida Globe, a man named Evan Porter. He did this right after the murders, and it's a book which has become a collector's item. It's not as valuable as most people who own it think it is, but it is a good item. He was a good reporter, and he did report the case in some detail. I think Porter thought that Lizzie was guilty, but he very carefully refrains from saying so because there were libel and slander laws even in those days. No one touched the case on a big scale except the Globe, which annually ran anti-Lizzie stories every anniversary. But no one touched the case until the 1920s because Lizzie was alive, and Lizzie had a great deal of money, and she could very easily have sued anyone who made any attempt to tie her to a case for which she was proved in court to be not guilty. Pearson began writing in the 1920s while Lizzie was still alive, and began collecting the evidence and pointing out the things that pointed to Lizzie's guilt. After her death, he finally wrote one of his articles in which he stated specifically that Lizzie did it, and that there was no doubt in his mind that she committed the murders.
Now, excuse me, did he state this as opinion or as fact?
Well, he stated this as fact based on a very extensive reading of the case. Pearson was an employee of the New York Public Library, had access to all their materials, and used the newspapers very, very extensively. And he did read, eventually, all 1,920 pages of the typewritten testimony, which I have also done. I know of only two other persons who've done this, but...
they're all put away safely someplace, right?
One volume has been recently missing. I understand...
Really?
Yes, and I understand also that I think University of Massachusetts is having Xerox copies made, and there is going to be a copy on deposit in the Superior Court in Taunton. So once that is done, I hope maybe I can make a Xerox copy of that copy. Pearson, in 1936 or 37 or so, published a book called The Trial of Lizzie Borden, in which he wrote a very good essay on Lizzie's life and on the background of the case, and then he edited the trial. And I say edited because he did include a great deal of testimony, almost all the pertinent testimony, but as Radin points out in his book, he very carefully omitted some elements of testimony which would not have supported his case, or which would have made his case doubtful. Before that came out, though, there was a play in New York called 9 Pine Street by Miles and Colton. This was written shortly after Lizzie's death. I think it appeared in 1933, and I think Lillian Gish played the role of Effie Holden, who was a spinster in New Bedford, Massachusetts, in 1886, who murdered her stepmother and her father. The authors of the play should have left it at that and said it was a very nice piece of fiction. But when they published the play, they said very specifically in the introduction that they had read all the information on the case, and they were able to prove conclusively that Lizzie was in love with a minister, that Mrs. Borden had kept her from marrying the minister, and therefore Lizzie killed her stepmother and then killed her father. There's no basis for this theory at all, and yet it's been repeated over and over again. The Lizzie's love life, the Freudianization of Lizzie, came about in the 1930s. And this play also, for example, has Mrs. Borden, that is the second Mrs. Borden, being responsible for the death of the first Mrs. Borden, this giving Lizzie a motive for revenge.
What was the first Mrs. Borden like?
I don't know. From all evidence, a very quiet, very pleasant lady. Lizzie, I don't think ever knew her real mother. Her mother died when she was probably 4 or 5. Her stepmother was the only mother she ever knew, and her stepmother did bring her up in this period. So that the idea that Mrs. Borden is responsible for the first Mrs. Borden's death is a ridiculous one. It's repeated, though, by DeMille in her ballet, and it's been used a number of times since. So that I think the Miles and Colton theory just doesn't stand up, and it's unfortunate that this has been accepted. Mrs. Belloc Lowndes used this in her novel, Lizzie Borden, A Study in Conjecture.
9 Pine Street was probably the way most of the public was reminded of the crime, wasn't it? Because that play was, as I understood it, traveled circuits all over the country.
Oh, yes, it played in Somerset as recently as maybe 15 years ago. Some famous actress, Julie somebody or other.
Harris?
She was married to George Nathan. I guess it was, yeah.
I'm not
She played
I remember when Ruth
Somerset
Gordon was here, she mentioned 9 Pine Street. Oh, I thought Don had something very pithy to say. So I'm sorry, I interrupted you when you said...
It's also produced quite regularly by amateur groups. Well, Mrs. Belloc Lowndes, an English writer, wrote a novel called Lizzie Borden, A Study in Conjecture, and she introduces Lizzie and the minister whom she loved, and then DeMille does it in her ballet. Again, she even has Mrs. Borden being responsible for the first Mrs. Borden's death and so forth, and giving Lizzie a reason for the murders. And I guess this theory has been continued over the years. There's no basis for it. In fact, the only ministers that Lizzie was friendly with were 2 elderly gentlemen of her father's vintage, Mr. Jubb and Mr. Buck. And they certainly had no romantic attachment for Lizzie, nor did she have any for them. So as I say, that theory has been used over and over and over again. And
yet it would seem strange that people didn't simply say, okay, that's dramatic license, because very rarely is theater or literature true.
No, you look historically, though, at what people think about Julius Caesar is from the play by Shakespeare.
Really?
I think a lot of people think that is it. That's exactly how it happened.
I would never.
No, most people like very nice, neat, pat solutions. One of the reasons, for example, that Alfred Hitchcock's recent version appeals to a lot of people is that if you study a mystery, it's always nice to know that the person that is most likely to be suspected is not guilty. And the person least likely to be suspected is the one who's found guilty. So you have this in Lizzie. Not only that, but it gives, in Emma, it gives
and
Lizzie...
we're going to have to hang on this mystery till after the news.
This is WALE Fall River.
Yes, it is. And we have a caller in the line, but we would like Jordan Fiore to finish running down all the theories before we take calls, and then we will open the lines for callers. The buses are not running, too, in case anyone was calling about that. And everyone knows how sad everybody is about that. Now, you had come to, we were talking a little bit about the fact that much of the Lizzie Borden legend was also dramatized and used fictionally. What are some of the other theories that have been most common?
Well, I had pointed out how the American people responded to the idea that Emma did. It appeals to our romantic nature. I think 1961, Edward Radin published a book in which he pointed out, using the very same evidence, but using all the evidence, that the most likely suspect for the murder was not Lizzie or her sister, but was Emma the maid. And again,
Bridget.
Bridget, I'm sorry, Bridget, the Bureau, I'm sorry. Bridget, and the evidence seems to be very, very well done. It's a good piece of documentation. I don't find it completely acceptable because I think of the character of Bridget, and it seems almost impossible that she could have committed the murders. But again, he has used the evidence and has used it very, very well.
Except she would be more likely to be a good axe woman. She chopped wood. That was part of her job.
Yes, but I don't think she would have been able to kill two people and go out and wash the windows and come back in and kill the second one.
Keep her cool that way.
This sort of thing. I don't think she was probably not bright enough to sustain that activity for that full morning. Then, of course, as John has mentioned, there was Mrs. Lincoln's, Victoria Lincoln, Miss Lincoln, her book on Lizzie, A Private Disgrace, in which she says that Lizzie was sick. She had lobar epilepsy. And
was there a proof of that?
I don't know of any. Victoria Lincoln says this is something which was very well known, and if it is, it escaped my attention. Most people I talked to about the case who knew a great deal about it never mentioned this possibility.
That's one of the reasons I was interested in seeing Lizzie's writing, because it would determine that.
I never heard this mentioned before. I've heard remarks about various outbursts she's had in the past, because the story about the Children's Theater incident later on.
I think I would have an outburst under those circumstances, maybe.
I think that, again, Victoria Lincoln talked about spells, and once you have a person who you watch all the time, you can tell that they do strange things, which may be perfectly normal. Well,
in the Children's Theater incident where she was accused of shoplifting, the worst thing I could see she did was get very angry. Now, I think that it would be perfectly natural to get very angry under those circumstances.
Yes, I think so.
I mean, why that was considered such irrational behavior, I don't know.
I don't know. Of course, I find it difficult to believe that a person of Lizzie's background and training and so forth could commit murders. But as you pointed out, murders are frequently done by the most unlikely people. And I know, having talked with Albert Morris, who's a famous sociologist and an expert on homicide, Morris said every one of us has within him the possibility of committing one good murder anyway, and then living a perfectly rational life without any interruption.
Murderers in prison are the least violent and the least... People who commit one murder, one crime of passion, are least likely to be difficult prisoners.
Most murders are crimes of passion.
Yeah.
Whereas robberies are well thought out usually.
And that's a known fact. But anyway, we'll go on with
it's a known fact because I said it. Everybody knows.
Yeah, well, these are some of the theories that have been presented over the years. I think what you have to do is read everything you can on the case, and then using the best documentation possible, make your best case. I did want to say one other thing about Mrs. Borden. She's been vilified in almost every one of these accounts.
Can I ask something about documentation before you do that? The difficulty with documentation, though, is that everybody has to use the same resources, right? The court records and, are they actually accurate? The newspaper accounts, which were colored in part by so-called yellow journalism, Pearson's book, Porter's book. And so everybody's working with that handicap, aren't they? Yes,
well, of course, this is true. Unless someone is actually present when the event occurs, then you really have no way of proving something. And even then, a person standing at different angles may see things in different ways. If you read the accounts of the Battle of Lexington, taken 3 or 4 days after the battle, and read the accounts by the same men on the 50th anniversary of the battle, you wouldn't think they were talking about the same fight.
Oh, this is true. Children raised in the same home talking about that home. It sounds like a completely different home because we all see something from our own observational stance. This is why I think, like in the attacks on Mrs. Borden, and you wanted to comment on that, somebody maybe with whom she had an altercation over the price of cabbage would have one viewpoint about her, and someone else would have another. So maybe.
The point is, I don't think she would. Mrs. Borden was a very kind, gentle woman in a very unfortunate position. As a second wife of...
Particularly after she got it with the axe.
But as a second wife in a home with daughters who obviously drew upon their love for their own mother. And also, she was in a difficult position because Mr. Borden had helped her family, and the girls resented any part of the money being used to help her side of the family.
Emma was an elder sister, wasn't she?
Yes, about 10 years older. Yeah.
Then Emma would have more cause psychologically to dislike Mrs. Borden than Lizzie would.
She didn't. She got along quite well with Mrs. Borden.
It's interesting, too.
She said she called her mother for a while, then she began just calling her Abby, and they got along very, very well.
And that's a fact that, again, is interpreted two ways in various books. One of them is that Emma got mad at Mrs. Borden or Abby, and that's why she wouldn't call her mother anymore. And others said it was because they had a very good friendship, and so they went to a first-name basis.
She would have been about 15 when...
Yes, my mother died.
I thought also that most of the books pointed out that almost all servants and people who worked with both Abby and Lizzie liked both of them.
They did, and I've talked, within the last year or so, with a lady who currently lives in New Bedford, who was Lizzie's housekeeper, who had nothing but the highest regard for her. Both sisters were very generous. Even as young girls, they were generous. They were active, Lizzie particularly active in the Fruit and Flower Mission and Sunday school and so forth. Both girls were generous even later on. A youngster in Fiore got money from them, got a chance for education and so forth through the generosity of the
Radden quotes a girl who was, I believe, one of the courts as saying she remembered Lizzie having been particularly kind to a young boy at a school.
That's Mrs. Margarito, my neighbor. Yes, she did.
And is that a true story?
Yes, and there were a number of other cases, very similar cases.
We better take a break for a message about special occasion fashions. Special occasion fashions from Louise's. And to 5:30 and Monday and Friday until 9.
And one other thing that I wanted to mention was about the police in the books I've read. It seems that the police have gotten a real bum rap. Either the people who support Lizzie seem to say that the police were viciously trying to find somebody and that they framed her, and the people who say that Lizzie was innocent seem to say that, or the people who say that she was really guilty say that the police just bumbled the job. And they could have convicted her, but they blew it.
I don't think either one of these is true. First, the police were, I think, very fair with Lizzie. They were very careful in their dealing with her. They were very careful in their investigation, and I think some people think they might have been just too careful. But the fact is that the police were not suspicious of Lizzie in the beginning, and they finally, after examining all the evidence they could, felt she was the most likely suspect. As far as bungling the case is concerned, I don't think they did. I think they did get every bit of evidence that was possible.
Because we have to consider their ability to gather evidence at that time, which would be different. The scientific equipment and the scientific measuring devices were not
they didn't
available
have.
in 1892.
Yes, they were not using fingerprints, although they were being used in France. They were not being used extensively in this country. But the police did call in experts. For example, they called in an expert from Harvard University, from their criminal medicine division, and they were able, in this way, to determine the approximate time of death of Mrs. Borden and of Mr. Borden. They did get as much scientific evidence as they could, and I think they presented a fairly good case in court.
We have had a caller waiting for ages, so let's take that call. Good morning, you're an Ephesus woman.
Well, I was listening to you talk, and Mr. Fiore was naming three things that this man remembered. The Fall River Line, and Lizzie Borden, and the pork pies.
Yes.
Do you know that we still have the pork pies?
I thought we no longer had that particular brand.
Yes. Could I name it?
Yeah.
The Hotley pork pies.
But I didn't think that they were available anymore.
Yes, it's the same exact place that they came from. Because my mother had a restaurant 46 years ago, and she used to sell them. And I know where she got them, and it's
Can't
still...
tell where she got them because that's a free
No,
commercial.
but I mean, it's exactly the same place. The pork pies are exactly
I
the
remember
same.
as a little girl going with my father and
Yeah.
you'd stand and, you were knee-high to everybody and you'd smell the gravy. It was
Yeah. Yeah, well, they still have them.
I'm very hungry.
Because I buy them when I want, when I want them. They're not open at all times, but at certain times, and I go and get them, and I have them. But they're it's been
Same place.
passed down from generation to generation, and they're exactly the same way as when I was small.
Are they really?
Yep.
That's good to
So
know.
they still have the hotly pork pie.
Well, thank you very much.
All right.
Calling, bye-bye.
Wonderful.
She called to say that on the wrong morning because I happen to be very hungry this morning and I keep getting that odor of those pork pies.
I went to a church dinner one night where I spoke. I had no idea they were serving them right there.
I didn't even know they were available.
They were selling them at the church fair, the Union Methodist Church one night. That's right.
We did have another call on the line. That caller did hang up, but we are taking calls now for Jordan Fiore to talk about Lizzie Borden, and that's the other caller, so let's take it. Good morning, you're next to someone. Yes.
I'd like to talk to Mr.
He's on the line. Go
Fiore.
ahead.
Mr. Fiore.
Yes.
I was once a newsboy of Lizzie Borden. 60 years ago. I was only about 14 years old. And she was one of the finest women I ever met. Very good-hearted. And do you know...
Was she a very big woman?
Not too big.
She was a petite lady.
Yeah, she medium-sized woman, you know.
Was she attractive?
Yeah, well, at their age at that time, she,
You weren't in a position to measure.
No, I was only a young boy.
Yeah.
And another thing, does he know the driver of his car's name?
The driver of Lizzie's car?
Yeah.
Do you?
No, I don't. I did know some years ago a man named Joe Daly who used to drive her when she hired livery equipment and drove over to Somerset and to...
There's a fellow by the name of Champagne. He was handicapped. He couldn't hardly walk, but he could drive a car.
Is he still living?
I don't think so. No. That was well, I was 14, around 1915.
Would he still have family here?
I don't know. I could say there were some relatives around of them, the Champagnes. At the time I was delivering papers. She lived in some kind of a cottage at the foot of June Street, and then they moved to Island Avenue.
Was that the French Street house then? Cottage on the foot of June?
You know, the technical high school right across the street.
No, that wasn't the French Street
That's
house.
on Cherry Street.
Yeah. Did she live with Emma at that time?
No, I don't know if Emma was there. I think she was
left in
alone. I don't know. I couldn't
She
say.
left in 1905.
I don't know that, but I do remember delivering papers. She was very nice. And the building at the corner of Anawan Street, and where Newbury's is there, that was the Andrew Borden building.
Yeah, we have to take a break. Thanks for your call. Bye-bye now. We have another caller on the line. We'll talk to them after this break. We'll take a call. Good morning, you're on Emphasis Woman. Yes, he's on the line.
Hello, Mr.
Hello.
I want to congratulate you.
Excuse me, first of all, would you like to turn your radio down?
Yes, one moment.
Okay. Okay, now she's done that. And I hear her tapping toes, and here she is back again.
Hello?
Okay,
Hello.
go ahead.
Yes, no, I want to congratulate Mr. Jordan, because I know I went to school when he did. Well, he was a little younger, but I was in school with his sister Anna at the Davis School.
Now you can tell us how old Anna is, you see.
Well, I won't mention that.
Who are you?
She doesn't have to give her name.
Oh, I see.
Okay, that's part of the anonymity of being a caller.
I went to Davis School, too.
Yes, I know, you did. You were younger, and Anna was in my class, anyway. But my husband tells me that he knows a man on Globe Street. He always said he chauffeured for Lizzie Borden. I think they call him Joe Ross. Joe Ross or Joe Rossi. I think it's Joseph Ross.
And he's still living?
As far as I know.
Joe Ross or Rossi?
Yeah, I think they call him Joe Ross. And he always said he chauffeured for Lizzie Borden.
Did he chauffeur her specifically, or was it through the livery service? Do you know?
Yeah, I think personally.
Oh.
And he lives in the house that looks like a schoolhouse on Globe Street. It's across from a plastic company.
I can't place that. But, oh, yes, I know where that is. Yeah.
If you're coming down, if you're coming up from Bay Street, you'll be on your left. And if you're coming down from Globe Street from Maine, it'll be on your right.
Yeah.
Down towards the bottom. And I was wondering if Mr. Jordan knew anything about it.
He must be quite an elderly man by now,
Yes, he is.
Yeah.
No, I don't know it. I've never come across the name before.
Yes.
I will look into it now, I can
Yes,
see that.
he always claimed, because he used to go to the club where my husband used to go to, and he always claimed he chauffeured her around personally.
Very good.
And he said she was a very nice, fine woman.
Well, all the evidence seems to be that, at least in these lady years, she was a very good and generous woman. I've never heard anyone saying anything against her as a person who knew her after the murders.
Yes, and I was wondering, like I said, wondering if she knew anything about it. But he always claimed that he's an elderly man. In fact, my husband said he came by the house today, and there was some people working around the house, And I said to him, I wonder if he, if he's still living there or what.
I will look into it.
We have to take a break after you call.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Bye-bye now.
Right.
We're going to get a lot of research out of the show this morning, and we have a message or two.
Again, we're getting people who remember things, and I would assume that a number of these must be valid, because in your research, is this how you research things? You hear about somebody and then you check it out?
Almost everywhere I've spoken, someone knows someone who knows something, and I do follow up almost all the leads.
And sometimes they pan out, and sometimes they don't, apparently.
This is true with any research.
Yeah, sure. Let's take another call. Good morning, Your Honor.
Shed a little light on the Lizzie Borden story.
Good. Go ahead.
I knew...
Jordan Fiore's on the line, by the way.
I knew Lizzie Borden in her later life. She lived on French Street.
Yeah.
We lived at the bottom of French Street.
What corner would that have been, the bottom of French?
Corner of Barnaby.
Is that below Maine or?
No, it's above Maine.
Okay.
We were very friendly with her last chauffeur, whose name was Carl Terry.
Carl Perry or Terry?
Terry.
Oh, yes, I knew him.
Terry.
Carl Perry.
Terry.
Terry, isn't it?
That's right.
Yes, I knew him.
T like in Thomas.
Yes, I knew him.
Was he from a sonnet?
No.
Well, of course, there are a great many Terrys in the sonnet, but I don't believe
he was a former man.
He lived on the Boston Road.
Yeah.
She was very kind to Carl Terry and his family. And every afternoon, he would take her and her dog for a ride in the limousine.
What kind of a dog did she have, do you know?
I can't remember, but it seems to me it was a long-haired dog, more of a poodle type. When she died, she left Carl and his family a goodly amount. She was always very kindly to him, I understand, and of course we were youngsters at the time, and we would run up French Street and run as fast as we could by the house, knowing the stories that were going around. And Mr. Terry used to say, how silly. She's one of the kindest women I've ever worked for.
I often think how the poor woman must have suffered from all of those kinds of things.
She was ostracized by everyone. You never saw anyone go to the house or speak to her. And even at an early age, you couldn't help but feel a little sorry.
It's remarkable that she didn't have a nervous breakdown or go insane from it.
And of course, at that time, Jordan's father, Fiore, was on French Street. And we knew
French's Hill.
Pardon?
On French's Hill.
On French's Hill.
Oh, yes, sure.
And we knew him very well. And I have very fond memories of Fiore.
Believe me, so have I.
And he used to say to us kids, oh, you silly kids. She'll never hurt you. Those stories about Lizzie Borden probably aren't true.
And now his son is living to prove that.
Well, I wonder. But anyway.
I guess you never can really disprove a myth. People want to believe she's guilty of that.
And the more horrible it is, the longer they remember it.
Yeah.
But I do know that these facts that I give you about her later life are true.
We do have to break because we're right up against the news, but thanks for your call.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye now. I guess that point is very true, that people like to believe the myth, and no matter how many facts you come up with contrary.
I knew my father would get into this eventually.
Why do you say that quickly with 10 seconds?
Because I have no identity of my own. I'm Faust's brother,
Fiore,
I'm Anna's brother, and Faust's son.
Well, you have identity here, and we'll be back after the news.
This is WF.
We have callers on the line, so why don't we take those calls? Good morning, you're an Emphasis Woman.
Just wanted to tell you what I heard.
Okay, Jordan Fiore's on the line.
Hello?
Hello.
I just wanted to tell you what I heard about this Lizzie Borden case from my mother or grandmother. And she had an Irish servant at the time of the murder named Sullivan.
It's Bridget.
What's that?
Her name was Bridget.
Yes. And she was either sent back or went back herself to Ireland after the murder.
No, she didn't. She may have gone to Ireland, but she came back to this country shortly after because she died in 1948 in Montana.
Is that so?
Yes.
Well, I heard that from my mother and grandmother. And,
Well, she did return to this country. If she did go to Ireland, I don't know, but she did return, and she lived out a long life and died in Montana.
Well, that's what the story was. She either was sent back or went back at the time after the murder.
I don't know who was sent her back. She was a witness for the prosecution, not for Lizzie.
I see.
And as I say, she did come back to this country.
Yeah.
That's one of the myths, though, that has been developed over the years.
Yes. Well, I just thought I'd call in and tell you about it anyway.
Thank you very much.
I heard from my people.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now. We had another call on the line, but let's start to talk a little bit about the myths. Many of the books, we have two other calls. We'll take those. Good morning, you're an Emphasis Woman.
Morning. May I speak to Gordon Fiore,
Sure.
please?
His name is Jordan Fiore.
Oh,
and he's on the
Jordan.
line.
Jordan, like the river.
Yeah. Good morning.
Morning.
Wasn't it true, sir, that the day the murder was committed, the Fall River police were on their annual outing to Rocky Point?
They were, yes.
Yes. And I think that was the last time that was held. Is that true?
I think that's true, yes.
Was
Yeah.
it because of the murder?
I don't know, but there were still police at the station. I mean, not all.
Oh, yes, it was a skeleton force.
Yes, not all the police went to
Yeah, well, wouldn't you say that was a well-planned murder, sir?
I don't know. By
Even
whom?
in those days?
Where was the main police station at that time?
It was on Granite Street.
Yeah.
If the person knew the police were going away and used that day, it might very well have been part of the plan.
Well, I think so, sir, because it had been an annual outing, because my mother, told me. She was young at the time, and I can remember in years, talking about it.
Was it public knowledge that this picnic was going to be held on a particular day?
Yes.
It was an excursion, actually. I guess they...
So all of Fall River would have known the police were on it?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, and I've read Victoria Lincoln's book, and I'm very interested, and I live on Prince Street. So I see her home, the home she had in her latter years. And didn't she have a protege named Nance O'Neill?
No, there was an actress. She died about 3 or 4 years ago at the age of 90-something. She was a fairly well-known actress in the period, yes. And she, I don't know whether she was Lizzie's protege. Lizzie was friendly with her and did have her as a guest in her home. Lizzie was very fond of the theater, very fond of art, too. She visited the museums quite regularly.
Well, it's been very interesting talking to you, and I enjoy it so much.
I'm glad you do. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, you're an Emphasis Woman.
I have a question for your guest.
He's on the line.
Number one, when was this murder committed? What year?
1892.
Now, of course, this was way before my time, and I have heard a lot of stories,
Are you a Fall River native?
No, Somerset.
Okay. That's pretty close.
You hear stories over the years, and you never know basically what happened. Like, for instance, I was wondering if you could give me a very brief summary of, like, where Lizzie was, who found the body, and all. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, the murders, of course, took place on 2nd Street. The house is still standing. Mrs. Borden was killed probably about 9:30 or so, and Mr. Borden was killed just before 11 o'clock. At the time that Mrs. Borden was killed, Lizzie stated that she was in her room. At the time that Mr. Borden was killed, Lizzie said she was out in the barn getting sinkers to go fishing. She had met her father at the door about 11:15 and had spoken briefly with him, and then he went to lie down on the divan in the living room, and Lizzie went out to the barn, as she said, to get some sinkers for fishing. She was going to go to Marion that weekend. And she came in and discovered the father's body on the sofa and called Bridget, the maid, who was in the third floor in her room in the attic. And Bridget came down, and Bridget went over and got Lizzie's friend, Miss Russell, and she came over, and the lady next door, Mrs. Churchill, came over, and then Lizzie sent Miss Russell and Mrs. Churchill upstairs to look to see whether Mrs. Borden was there, and they found Mrs. Borden's body.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for your call.
Okay.
We have another caller on the line, but we have to take a break, and then we'll come back. Okay, we have 2 callers, so we'll take those. Good morning, you're on Emphasis Woman. Yes.
That's something that might interest both you and Mr. Fiore.
Okay.
And it's an article from the New York Recorder dated September 19th, 1892. It is an interview with Lizzie while she was in prison in Clanton.
You have a copy of this?
Yes, I do. The original. And what is fascinating about it, and I think this may interest you, it is signed by a Mrs. McGurk. And that's fascinating to me because I thought the Fourth Estate was at that time very unfair to ladies.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if it actually...
that old plug-o in for the ladies.
Well, you know, I was wondering if it was actually done by a woman reporter or whether it was a gentleman.
Men wrote and used women's names for reading columns.
Right, except that the interview itself is not that long. It's about 3 columns long. But then the reporter gives his own editorial comment, and he calls it a distorted picture, and that she's broken by grief, and it ends up saying that this is the first true light shown on Miss Borden's personality.
Yeah.
And I thought if you and Dr. Fiore would like to have it, you can drop down at the office Monday and pick it up.
Okay.
I'd like very much to...
and I've just written to him what office you're referring to.
There were a number of women reporters, and I might point out, Lizzie got very good treatment from the press.
Yes, she did.
Very good. I mean, they did very well by her. Even the day of her acquittal, the New York Times carried a full editorial blasting the police and saying, "Hope this poor persecuted woman now will be left alone."
Well, Gene, I'd like you to see this particular book. It's a collection of newspaper clippings from 1892, and it's all about women.
Very
fascinating things, the things that women did, and. One woman did it all.
It's at the Chamber of Commerce office?
It's the Chamber of Commerce office, but it's my book. But you may have it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye now. Good morning, you're an Emphasis Woman.
Jean, first I noticed no one has congratulated you upon your new office.
Oh, thank you.
As National President of the Catholic Amazon.
Catholic Gitchigumi, yes.
Yeah. And secondly, you can get those pork pies if you want to call me.
Don't tell where.
No, I'm not going to, because they're open from 5:30 to 11, and they're 50 cents a piece, and they're still the same as they used to be. Every day of the week, including Saturday. And may I speak to Jordan? I've known him since we were kids.
He's on the line right now.
Jordan?
Yeah.
My mother was a little girl at the time of the Borden murder, and you know how kids climb over the fence?
Yeah.
And she said she had a male cousin living in the house. There was a male cousin living in the house.
Lizzie did?
Lizzie had a male cousin living in the house with them.
I don't think so. There was a guest there.
Maybe that was her boyfriend.
No, there was her own mother's brother, John Vinicum Ross.
Well, she despised her stepmother. There was a terrible feeling between them. All the neighbors knew it. She had always despised her stepmother. And Mother said it was a hot August day, and they had a wood stove going, and he was very cheap, Mr. Borden. He bought the cheapest of mutton. They were having mutton stew that day.
Well, they were having it all that week, I'm afraid.
Well, he used to buy a bolt of cloth, Mother said, till all the cloth was gone, and he was he was so cheap that the Indian was riding on a buffalo's back.
Well, I think he was. I think he was.
And I think Lizzie was wonderful because I knew her when I was a little girl, and she used to invite my father fixed her car, and she would invite me to sit up on her porch with her, and I've had tea with her. And she never poisoned me.
No, I'm sure she
And I think she was wonderful. She invited me to stay for weekends at her house, but my mother wouldn't let me.
Well, I will talk a little bit later about Mr. Borden because I think he was parsimonious, but I also want to point out some generosity on his part.
Parsimonious is a very kind.
But that was also the characteristic of the fathers of that era.
And across the street was Dr. Bowen, who was her cousin, and was the first doctor on the scene, and the Bowen sisters would not accept the money when it was left because they claimed it was tainted.
Really?
Well, we don't know about them either.
Well, congratulations on your new office.
Okay, thank you.
Call me after. I'll tell you where you can get the prize.
Okay, fine.
Thank
you. Bye-bye now. We do have to take a break for message. We have another call on the line. You're a very popular guest.
Yeah.
Very good. We'll have you back and back and back if everyone has a lot to say to you. But we have a message from Edgar's, and they want to... Okay, we have two callers on the line. The subject this morning is...
This is a serious subject, Gene.
The subject is obviously, everybody knows, is Lizzie Borden, and our guest is Jordan Fiore. Good morning, you're an Emphasis Woman. Yes, he's on the line.
Hello, Jordan. How are you?
Oh, fine, thank you.
This is a friend of yours who was brought up with you and Faust.
Oh, very good.
And you know he's not Faust or Anna, don't you? You know he's Jordan.
Oh, yes, I know Anna and I know Faust very well.
But you know that this is Jordan.
That I know.
Okay.
That I know. And I also knew your dad.
Good.
Who played with me in a band. And I wanted to congratulate you.
Thank you.
On a fine job that you're doing, Jordan.
Thank you.
And it makes you feel good to see that you and Faust became something.
Well, thank you very much. It's always nice to talk to friends.
And if you take me off the air, I'll tell you my name.
Okay, we can't do that, unfortunately. Maybe you could call him back after the show.
I probably will.
Okay.
We were brought up together, and we all played in the same band together.
Good. Very nice talking to you.
Well, thanks for calling.
Right.
Bye-bye
Good
now.
luck to both of you.
Good, thank you. Bye-bye. Good morning, you're an Emphasis Woman. Yes.
I'd like to talk to Mr. Jordan, please.
He's on the line.
Hello.
Hello, Mr. Jordan.
Yes.
Did I hear you tell one of the callers before that Abby was murdered about 9:30?
I think that was...
And the father about 11?
Yes.
And could you tell me exactly who else was in the house? Just Abby and the maid?
And Lizzie.
And Lizzie and the maid?
Yes.
And Emma wasn't at home?
Emma was visiting friends at Fairhaven.
I see. Couldn't it be possible that it could have been either one of the two? There's an hour and a half left between the two murders.
Yes. Well, of course, Radin in his book makes it out that Bridget did it, and that she killed Mrs. Borden and then went out and washed windows, and then when Mr. Borden came home, killed him.
Oh, I see.
And she times everything exactly right, and it might very well have happened that way.
He has a plotted out graph of the time to prove it. But one of his other points about why Bridget did it was that she knew exactly where the axes were.
Bridget.
Yeah, but that doesn't follow in my mind, Jordan, because a housekeeper would know where the axes are.
Yes.
That's true, too.
Now, you know, it isn't just because she would have used them for murder, but as the woman who did the wood chopping,
what type of a woman was Bridget?
Evidently, she'd been in this country about 3 years. Most people thought she was a very quiet woman. She had some relatives in Florida, I guess, who were responsible for her being here. From all accounts, she was a very quiet, unobtrusive lady, and she was called upon by the prosecution as their witness. She made a very good statement for Lizzie in terms of character, and Lizzie's lawyer used her very, very well in trying to develop the idea that the tension in the family was not as great as the prosecution
I'm trying to make out. If they're both, very nice and quiet, both Lizzie and Bridget, what type of person could have done this? And
nice, quiet people, obviously.
Yes, I could have lived with this in a murder one, and an hour and a half later there's another murder.
There's a characteristic type of personality which appears very charming on the surface, but inside
That's true.
Seething, and at some point something triggers.
I'm going to sit down at the table now.
Although it may seem to me.
No, that's true. And then something triggers it, and they just explode. They rarely would premeditate anything.
Yes.
They would just skyrocket off for some
small reason. To me, it may be
like Lizzie, for the reason she has lived with these people, with the father and the stepmother for so many years. Although I don't want to. I hate to say I'm pointing her out, but I can't see much reason for a maid who's been here just a few years doing this type of thing and still living in this house.
Well, the great fascination with the Lizzie Borden case is the fact that it doesn't make any sense, does it?
It doesn't.
Both women would probably, at first glance, appear to be the most unlikely persons to have committed such a murder.
Either they had no conscience or what, I can't make it out, you know?
And neither have about 67 theorists who've done it.
It's true. Let's say even if a mother has children, the child does something wrong, she hits the child, but she does have this feeling feels bad she hit this child. And someone murdering someone else and just...
Because no one really knows that Lizzie didn't feel badly after that. I mean, there's no one that talks much about how Lizzie felt. They say she didn't appear to have any sense of
I know that, but what I'm trying to say is, doing one murder, how could they do another one right
Because
after?
it was so successful.
I could see in a rage or temper, one right after another. But an hour and a half...
Yeah, isn't that one of the problems that all the theorists have roped with?
Whoever did it very
you understand
coolly.
what I'm trying to say? Someone may go hysterical and go into a rage and do one thing and do one right after another.
Well, it may be the person who did the first one felt it necessary to cover his or her tracks by doing the second one.
Yeah, I understand that. But
we have another caller.
All right,
thank you. Bye now. Good morning, you're an Emphasis Woman.
Lizzie Borden.
Yes.
Well, didn't that Mrs. Bridget Sullivan go to live in Boston after she came back from Ireland?
I don't know. She died in Montana in 1948.
Oh, in 1948?
Yes.
Well, it was a strange thing. I got on the bus one afternoon, one evening, and this girl got on it in Boston. I worked in the State House, and this girl come on, and she was a librarian, and she lived in the south end of Boston. And we got talking, and she said, oh, if you're from Fall River, you must know about the Lizzie Borden case. And I said, well, I said, that's an old story. I'm 85 years old now, you know. So she said, she said, I know Bridget Sullivan, she said. And she said that Lizzie Borden used to come to the hotel on the corner of Bowden and Beacon Street. And she said she had a room there, and that she and Lizzie, you know, it's very friendly.
Yeah, we have another caller. Do you have a final point?
All right.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye now. Good morning, you're an Emphasis Woman.
Where is the house that Lizzie Borden's father died in?
On 2nd Street. I think it's now number 200.
Do you know where the parking lot is on 2nd Street just before Spring?
Yeah.
It's across the street from that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye now. We have only about a minute and a half.
2 minutes. And the thing about Bridget and Lizzie both being in there was Knowlton. Is that the name of the?
Knowlton, yes.
Yes, the prosecutor. In several of the books I read, it seemed they said that he believed that they had worked together, and that both of them were in on it.
Possible too, right?
But they'd be more likely to, I think, get a confession out of somebody when you have two people involved.
Well, they seem to think that part of the reason that Lizzie was worried about Bridget's testimony was that they were in on it, and she was afraid that Bridget might break.
No, Lizzie's lawyer used Bridget very, very well. A man named Liscott, an Englishman, has done a study on the case itself on the trial. He points out how
Lizzie's so relaxed, Jordan, we forget it's radio, and that's why everybody leans away from my...
I was just chatting with Don. I had no idea that Barbara was listening in. One of the...
That's what the whole show is like.
Thank you. Liscott, who's an English writer, Eric Liscott, has done a study of the trial itself. He points out how Lizzie's lawyer, George Robinson, was so clever in his talking with the jury that even in his interviewing or his cross-examination, he had Bridget admit that they got along very well as a family. There was no real friction. They got along as well as any family did. That Lizzie had breakfast some days with her family and did not on other days and so forth. And it rather demolished the contention of the
prosecution that there was bad blood in the family.
We just have about 15 seconds before the news, and we will get back to this. One final thing that I would like to say, since I don't get to talk when the phones are being used, and that is that Victoria Lincoln's theory about how one murder could be committed and then another one later was that Lizzie really meant to kill in a rage or fury Abby, and then actually killed her father because she couldn't face him, because she did love him and couldn't face him with that. And I understand that. Not that I've ever killed anybody.
You know, another day. Well, if you want me to tell you whether I think Lizzie did it or not, I'm not going to. I haven't done it yet. No one knows what I really think about that, and not even my wife, who knows most things about me.
Could I ask, do you really know what you think about it?
Yes, I do. I have a very definite opinion. Let me just say this. If I were on the jury in 1893 and listened to all the evidence that was presented at that particular trial, all the evidence the jury was allowed to hear, I would have voted for Lizzie's acquittal. Because I think that the judgment was correct based on the evidence the jury heard. After having read all the things I read and listened to all the people who talked and read the newspapers and having gone through the entire transcript of the trial, if I were sitting on a jury today, I would still vote for Lizzie's acquittal. I'm not saying she didn't do it. I'm not saying she did. What I am saying is that the government did not prove its case against Lizzie beyond a reasonable shadow of a doubt. And I think this is the case hinges on the government's necessity to prove its case.
Now, was the investigation geared toward Lizzie because somebody assumed she was guilty?
Well, the Florida police had already decided. The murders took place on a Thursday. The Florida police had already decided, probably by Saturday night or Sunday morning, that Lizzie was the most likely person. And from this point on, most of their attention was drawn to making the case against her. But I think it's also fair to the police to say that every single possible suspect was examined. Every theory that was brought to them, every accusation brought to them was very carefully examined by the police. And this meant almost any crank in town who had a candidate had his candidate examined by the police.
Who were some of the candidates?
Well, there was a story that there was a wild-eyed young man walking down 2nd Street, and some very reputable persons saw him. There was a story that some farmer from across the river who had, just like Mr. Borden, had threatened him. There was a story about some gypsy horse traders in the area who had threatened, had a fight with him and might very well come back to kill him. There was a story about a man who was seen wandering around the woods with an axe in his hand and covered with blood, who said that he had killed some people. There were a number of these theories, and almost, well, if you were to believe the people who claimed to have been walking on 2nd Street on that hot August morning, it would have been like Times Square at 8 o'clock in the evening. There just weren't that many people around.
People didn't walk on 2nd Street that much, did they?
Well, they probably did, but you know, the fact is that almost as soon as any event takes place, there are always a large variety of witnesses who are nowhere near the place. And, of course, I have talked to any number of people who told me about their mothers being present or their fathers being present at the trial or at the house or at the funerals, and the place would not have been large enough to hold all these people.
So people sort of project themselves
yes,
into the
and I think after a while, if the story is repeated enough, even the person who claims to participate really believes it happened to him. There was a story, for example, about some tradesman in town who delivered a barrel of flour to Lizzie's house. And the barrel needed opening, and Lizzie asked him to open the barrel of flour. And he had nothing to do with it, so she's nothing to do it with. So she said, well, wait a minute, I'll get a hatchet. And at that point, he jumped out of the house and out to his horse and wagon and drove off madly down French Street. Now, I've heard this story told about happening in Flint's store. It happened in Brown's store. It happened in any number of stores in town. And only recently, a young man told me a story which he said he swore was true. He said, when I was a young fellow, I worked for my father, and I delivered this flour to Lizzie, and he told me the whole story as though it happened to him. It was a barrel of apples instead of flowers in his case. Although what Lizzie was doing, a whole barrel of apples for one lady, kind of escapes you at this point. But at least he told me the story. He jumped into his car And he drove off madly because he was afraid Lizzie was going to kill him with a hatchet. Now, the only thing that was wrong with this story was this young man was born in 1916, and Lizzie died in 1927. So sometime before he was 11 years of age, he worked for his father and drove a wagon and drove the car and delivered barrels of apples and so. Now, he believes this. Yeah. I pointed out how completely erroneous this was, and he said, I remember this very, very well. He couldn't have. And yeah, as I said, I've heard this story told over and over and over again.
Well, that reminds me of the myths of all the hatchets they keep finding.
Oh, yes.
How many of them are there now?
Well, there have been 3, I guess. And one of them, I guess, the last one, the man said he deliberately planted there. One of the hatchets they found, or supposed hatchets, contained some spots on it. They were shielded of blood, and they found out there were aluminum stains and aluminum paint, and aluminum paint was not invented in 1892.
Didn't they find 2 in the walls of a closet recently? In that
well, they found one, of course, in the barn when that was torn down.
But there was more than 3.
Oh, I don't know.
Any number.
I have 3 that are documented.
Oh, but everyone finds a hatchet. Everyone walks by.
But didn't the police actually eliminate most of these stories by the fact that the murders did take place at least an hour apart, probably an hour and a half apart, that someone would have either have to be hiding in the house all that time or have to come in and leave unseen twice?
Well, this is the basis for the police case, but it would have been very difficult for anyone to have hidden in that house during that period of time.
It's opportunity, then.
Well, is the hour and a half the maximum amount of time between which the deaths could be committed?
Just about,
Or could they
may have been,
closer together?
No, they weren't close together. I mentioned the police used scientific means. This Professor Woods at Harvard actually examined the stomachs of both Mr. Borden and Mrs. Borden, and by determining the extent to which the digestion had taken place, was able to pinpoint the murders pretty exactly. Lizzie saw her father at quarter 11 and saw him dead at just before 11 o'clock, so that you could pinpoint that murder within minutes.
Because if Lizzie truly were an epileptic, it's possible that she committed the murder either prior to or following a seizure, and then seeing her father triggered off another seizure.
She saw her father and spoke to him very, very calmly and told him...
But that's possible in pre-epileptic state, to be very calm, and then after an epileptic seizure to do something violent.
Well,
but I would like to see whether they can document that. We've got to take a break for a message from Louise's. And ironically...
Well, I probably should mention that, I don't know whether we're supposed to mention this or not, that you're working on a book on this subject. Do you have any idea when that will be ready for publication?
No, I have a first draft done. It's been done for some time, but I also have a contract to do 2 other books, and one of them is almost done, and the other one is on its way, and I think those are going to take priority. Those are...
Lizzie?
History. As I've observed, I spent a whole lifetime trying to become an historian, and my popularity seems to be based on what is essentially a hobby.
Question, there's also a film going to be out soon on Lizzie,
yes,
isn't there?
20th Century Fox is doing it. It's going to be directed by Robert Mulligan, and the man who's writing the script, David Lang, was in Little Compton last summer and spent the summer there doing some work on the script, and I was a consultant with him on the case. Will it be an authenticated story, or will it be fictionalized like the others? I don't think it'll be fictionalized, although Mr. Lang's concern is very much like mine. He's very much concerned with the effect of the murders on the people of Florida, the attitude, the reaction after the murders took place.
That's one of the things I wanted to ask you about, the sociological aspects of that, because I think it was Victoria Lincoln that pointed out the conflicts between the Yankees and the Irish, and felt that this contributed in part to the attacks on Lizzie and the desire to prove her guilty by the Irish police force. I don't think so. First place, the Irish police force was not thoroughly Irish. There were Irish policemen, but there were a lot of Yankee policemen, including the marshal and the man who was in charge of the investigation. Both were Yankees. I don't think this was a major factor. The interesting thing about the case is that shortly after it took place, almost everyone in town wanted to believe Lizzie innocent, and most of the public opinion supported Lizzie. It was after she was acquitted and came home that the public attitude seemed to change almost completely in the feeling that she must have been guilty. That's very interesting. The papers, though, took opposing views, and there were attacks on the fact that the 2 older papers were conservative, and the newer Globe was using this as a way to sell papers. Yes, well, of course, the Globe was it was a newspaper that was owned by Irish Catholics, and almost anything the Yankee element in the city did was not acceptable to them. And this gave them a wonderful opportunity to hit them on that basis, and they did. I think it's a case that really is great fruit for sociologists and psychologists. We have a couple of calls, and I know people dying to talk to you, so let's take those. Good morning, Your Name, Mr. Swimmer.
Hello?
Good morning. Oh, those callers hung up. We are going to take calls, and the lines are open at 6301 and 6302. Let's take a break, and then we'll come back with more talk with Jordan Fiore. We have a call on the line, so we'll take that. Good morning, Your Honor. This woman.
Your guest mentioned in the Lizzie Borden case that the young fellow that delivered the barrel of flour and run out, well, it was my husband.
He was one of the many who did it.
He's the one that delivered the barrel of flour from Carbates and Yerxa.
Carbates and Yerxa. My mother's mentioned that.
Yes.
And what year would that have been?
What year would that be, Jim? In 1913 or 14. Yeah.
So there is an authentic person who really did this.
That's right, and he was a young boy, and he worked for Carbates and Yerxa, and it's true, he delivered it by horse and wagon, and the name of his horse was Billy.
The name is probably the thing to do would be to give Jordan Fiore a call or to write to me here, and I could forward the letter to
my husband's right here. He's polishing my kitchen nut set.
Good for him. He's an okay person.
Well, he was born in 1891. My husband.
I see.
And he's retired from the post office department.
I see. Well, I think it'd be a good idea maybe if you dropped a note here to Jordan and gave us your name and address so he could follow up.
All right.
Okay?
Yeah,
Thank you.
all right.
Okay. Bye-bye now. There may really be an actual person who's done this.
Carbates is one of the companies, yeah.
Yeah,
also,
Carbates and Yerxa.
Yeah. There's an SSPS.
Yeah. That was sort of a general foods and hardware stuff.
Yeah, no, SSPS products.
Just SSPS?
Yeah. Very good groceries, very good.
There was one thing that we wanted to get into, and that was a little bit more about the personalities of the members of the family. You said something about the parsimonious Mr. Borden.
Well, Mr. Borden was careful with his money. There's no doubt about it. You couldn't accumulate the kind of fortune he did in those days as an undertaker to begin with, and then in other fields he moved into banks and manufacturing and so on without being very careful. The pennies made dollars. And I think it's probably true. They had mutton made more than they should have, but there's a kind of carefulness that people of that generation practiced. The fact that you were wealthy didn't give you the right to waste.
Yeah, but why was such an emphasis placed on the mutton? Wasn't that a fairly common daily?
I think they had about 3 meals from it, plus soup for breakfast.
But wasn't the tradition?
I mean, the idea of mutton soup on an hot August morning, you see, could very well inspire murder.
All I can think of is a fire going in a stove, ironing, and heating water to wash windows and hot mutton soup. I mean, I'd murder for that. But my point is that the traditional meal was in that area. You made a big meal on Sunday, usually of a beef or one kind of meat. Mutton was a weekday meat, wasn't it?
Yes, usually.
So it wasn't unusual to have mutton.
No, it may not have been the most delicate of meals, but there certainly wasn't any shortage in terms of quantity. Yeah. I want to point out that Mr. Borden was a generous man to his daughters. They both had good allowances, I think either $4 or $6 a week, at a time when a working man made about $2 a day. He had allowed Lizzie to go to Europe on a trip with the girls of a group in so-called Marion crowd in 1890. And she'd spent the summer in Europe.
A very classy group of ladies.
Yes, they were. One of my teachers had a sister who was in that group. They did go on this type of trip. And then, even a couple of years before the murders took place, Mr. Borden bought some property on 4th Street, I think, yes, or Spring Street, and gave it to Mrs. Borden's sister. The girls objected to this, saying that he should do as much for them as did for her family. So Mr. Borden gave both sisters a house, the family house on Ferry Street, and told them they could have it outright, they could collect the rents on it, pay the taxes, it belonged to them.
Was it only hearsay that the girls objected?
No, I think they admitted they did. Mm-hmm. And which is not unusual in families, even to this day. But anyway, they did have the house. They kept it for a period of time. They didn't like the idea of playing landladies. They went back to Mr. Borden, and they sold him the house. They sold him the house they'd given him for $5,000 cash.
Chipped off the old lot, right?
And they got that money only about, less than a month before the murders. And they did divide the money, and Lizzie put hers in her account, and Emma put hers in her account. Now, this, as I say, is a careful man, but he wasn't stingy as far as his daughters were concerned. If you remember, the police came to Lizzie's room and saw her dresses. She admitted she had a closet full of dresses. This was a time when most women had two dresses, one for every day and one for Sunday. And the girls did have a dressmaker who came and stayed at the house every spring and every fall and made dresses for them for the season.
Well, now the challenge of the dress she gave the police was that it was a silk dress, and no decent, quote-unquote, Victorian lady wore a silk dress for breakfast and to do the dishes. So is it possible then that since he was a generous man, they might have had a silk dress for weekday wear around the house?
Oh, I think it's within the realm of possibility, yes.
Yeah.
Oh.
So that maybe isn't such a valid point.
Also, the fact that the dress was never found. I mean, they talk about they talk about having burned the dress and that was the dress, but they conducted two apparently extensive searches, never found a blood-stained dress.
Nor did they find blood on Lizzie, which I think is very important. Although she discovered her father's body within minutes of the actual murder, and all these persons were there, no one recalls seeing any blood anywhere on Lizzie's person. Not splattered in her face or her hair or on her arms or clothing or so.
Yeah, and it wouldn't have splattered.
This was a very important factor in the defense's case.
Was one of the reasons that they chose it to be Lizzie the fact that apparently she did not seem hysterical, that she seemed to be pretty self-contained? Several of the books mention that as a criticism of her.
Well, I might very well have, although I do feel that in many cases there are simulations of grief that people take on because they feel they have to. Lizzie was not made this way. There are a lot of people I know who feel grief very deeply and yet who are reticent to show it. Yeah. I happen to be a crybaby myself. I mean, if I'm sad, the whole world knows it. Well, there are other people who are not.
The little I've seen of Lizzie's writing would say that she was very schooled in the proper ways to do things. And she, sort of like Jackie Kennedy at the funeral. You know, she would have played whatever the role was. I don't think she was prone to carry on publicly, for instance.
No, I'm sure of that.
She might in anger, but as far as something like that is concerned, her grief would probably be self-contained. And yet, as I said in a few of the books, they attacked her on that basis and said, therefore, she must have been the murderer. We have just 2 minutes left. Do we have any very important thing that we haven't talked about that we need to sum up on? We talked a little bit about the personalities. You mentioned something earlier about Emma's personality and how she behaved after it was over.
Well, she certainly stayed by Lizzie in the entire affair. The only thing I pointed out was that people think that there was something queer about Lizzie and they dismiss Emma as being perfectly rational. I pointed out that Emma and Lizzie broke up some years later over Nance O'Neill, and Emma moved out of the house and eventually went to New Hampshire. Emma was as wealthy as Lizzie was, yet she left her place in New Hampshire twice a year, once to put her fur coat in storage, and in the fall to take it out of storage. And when she died, she left to go all the money she inherited, plus a great deal it had earned. Lizzie, on the other hand, lived in a very nice house, took trips, went to Washington, visited the Corcoran Gallery, went to New York, went to Boston quite regularly, stayed at the best hotels, and when she died, left considerably less than Emma did. And I would ask anyone to tell me which one had the more rational behavior afterward.
Question, how old was Emma when this happened?
Probably 42 or 43.
So she was actually a maiden lady, an old maid, quote-unquote, at that time. Yes. Does anyone have any theories about why she didn't marry?
No, neither girl, of course, married, and I never heard any theories except one that John Beeston did in the opera on Lizzie Borden, in which he points out that Emma had a lover who was a ship captain, and Mrs. Borden kept them from marrying, and Lizzie killed Mrs. Borden out of revenge for this. But these Freudian approaches, I guess, are going to be more and more as the
time
case
goes on.
No.
This has been very, very interesting. We're right up to the end of the show. We have just 10 seconds. Thanks, Jordan, for being here.
I've enjoyed it very much.
Next week we'll be talking about foods.
Will you look